Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Abuse Recovery Success, where we help you find the light on the other side of your own darkness. Here today, I am so blessed and excited to actually have a sister in recovery with me. I actually met Brittany, our guest, in AA, and we remained in touch. And as this podcast has evolved and we've really taken to the studio, she was one of the first people I thought of to be a guest on our podcast. Welcome, Brittany, to the episode. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's so good to have you, and I'm really excited for you to share with the listeners your strength journey and hope. Brittany, I think even though the rooms of AA can get crowded, you've always been someone I've thought of even when I haven't been able to get to AA. And really the purpose of this podcast is to touch those in recovery, but not only those in recovery, but those of us who have been through trauma in the past. So in today, you're going to tell them your story. Feel free to touch on any trauma you've experienced as well as what you're going through in the journey of recovery. I'll let you take the stage.
All right. Sounds good. Well, I'm really excited to be here. So thank you for inviting me. Mm-hmm. It's like you said, the rooms of AA do get pretty small. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that, I feel like sharing my story in that kind of closed space it's different. It's just a different story because I don't talk about any sort of trauma in those spaces. Yeah. So this is kind of a unique experience and a very different one. So,
yeah.
But yeah. So let's see where to even start. I wrote a page and a half of really what I wanted to say, but I guess just to tell you my story. So my experience was most of my issues come from a lot of relationship abuse. And so if we were talking about that, that doesn't, it's a chicken and the egg question for me, whether did the relationship and family violence come first and then that led me to become a drug addict, or was the drug addiction something that I used to cope with that?
Sure.
So it's kind of an interesting pattern. I don't have an answer to that, but that's something that is part of my story, is both of those things together. And
take us from, you touched on the family, so take us from maybe a little bit of your youth and then maybe when you first got introduced to, drug usage or alcohol or any of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So my first experience with abuse is more so kind of the neglect and abandonment of it. So none of my family was really party to me being raised. Okay. And so that was very different as a child experiencing that versus how I look at it now, because my thoughts back then was that something about me was inherently wrong, mm-hmm. and that the people that are biologically programmed to love me just didn't. And so that was something that really influenced how I behaved, because I chose to believe that narrative versus trying to teach myself how to love myself. And so a lot of who I was and who I grew up to be throughout high school was someone that I wanted to learn how to change myself. Mm-hmm. Because this person that I was as a kid was unlovable. I needed to do something to change myself so that people would love me or care about me, or, something to that effect. And I had a hard time coping with that. And so a lot of dealing with those emotions really looked like me turning to drugs and alcohol to kind of numb those feelings out. And so my reality looked like that I was afraid to get close to people because of that abandonment fear. But then I hated being alone, mm-hmm. because I always wanted someone that I felt like cared about me. And so that was kind of the perfect setup for that cycle of abusive relationships that I found myself in. So let's see. I pretty much began using drugs around 15, and the first time that I went into recovery, I was 23. And so I think that's right around the time that I met you, is mm-hmm. when I was pretty brand new, bright-eyed, bushy-tail. I was gonna turn my life around. And for the most part, I did. So I've been sober for a few years now, and that was something that felt really good. But that didn't really fix a lot of the emotional issues that I had still from the inside. And so something that I was really part of my story was that to heal, you have to do it from the inside out. And so I've been trying to focus on that more and trying to, I wouldn't even know how to tell you. Just like, it wasn't enough to stop using. It had to be something more. And even when I was sober, I found myself in bad circumstances and relationships that I couldn't tell you how I got into. And
well, let's dig in. Let's talk about childhood. So, because I'm relating to a lot of things, but what I really want to know is the neglect and abandonment. And if you're comfortable with it, share, because what we have to remember on this podcast is there's listeners all over not only the country, but the world that listen. So we're international. And, there could be someone, what I always try to remember when I'm speaking to this is there could be someone listening right now that has that exact feeling. And there's different ages, where they might feel alone and they truly feel something's inherently wrong with them. And I so relate to that inherently wrong. But let's talk about what you said your biological parents weren't around. Were you like in foster care? Were they around? Were they just not present? Is there addiction in your family? Like, tell me more about what life looked like for a little Brittany.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so my father was a drug addict. And so that was something that he was very violent, addicted to drugs. And that was a really bad and scary family dynamic. Mm-hmm. And my mother chose to go to medical school. And so both of them had went their separate ways, mm-hmm. which left my sister and I alone. Mm-hmm. And we were kind of adopted by our grandparents. Mm-hmm. And so that was great that they took us in. But that was still something that neither one of my parents wanted us. Yeah. They couldn't really take care of us. So that was a fact as well. But it didn't feel like a fact. It felt like that's what they chose.
Yeah. I get it. I mean, I don't know why I've been thinking about this lately, but I've been thinking about I used to get bombed at weddings and get so freaking depressed and like maybe even act a little crazy or say something weird because I was so jealous over these dads giving away their daughters at the wedding and having a dance with them, saying nice things. And this thing would happen in the back of my mind, my brain, like no one's ever loved me like that. Like I totally get what you're saying. It's like, regardless if you had this loving grandparents that came in and that was wonderful. And I'm happy for you that happened. You still have the fact of this weird intrinsic feeling of like just not being okay because these core people didn't love you and didn't value you. And quite frankly, it can be more, I don't know if you relate to this, but if it's more painful when you're watching healthy relationships out there and you're seeing it. And then you think more, even if you know logically, you think more like, what is wrong with me? Mm-hmm. I don't know. You know Roxy, right?
Absolutely.
I've had to play her little thing in my head so many different times saying like, it wasn't you. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with you. If you were this little person that was just put in there and they would have treated any little person like that. And so, I mean, sounds like a similar situation. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about then you started using drugs at 15. You dropped that one on us, but what kind of drugs? Like, was there a gateway? How did it start? I mean, even just tell us about that first use. Like, was there a driving factor? Like, you were at a party. Tell us more about that.
Mm-hmm. So that was around 15. My mom had taken me back into her custody. Mm-hmm. And so my sister and I were split, which was another difficult situation. And but she was in her residency. So mm-hmm. I was home probably alone 90% of the time. Mm-hmm. And the way that I found that I connected with people was through alcohol. Mm-hmm. And so I found this older crowd of people that I spent my time with that were probably between 20 and 30 years old. And me as a 15-year-old, that's who I spent my time with. And somehow I got a fake ID. And so I was able to be bar hopping at a pretty young age and getting introduced to all these different lifestyle choices that really weren't appropriate for me. But And really no one knew that I was doing that because no one was home.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't matter if I slept in my car at the bar, or if, someone took me home that shouldn't have, or anything like that, because it didn't, no one was home to know that I didn't come home.
So, okay. And so it started maybe more alcohol, some drugs. And then, like you said, you got into the rooms at 23. What was like your real DOC? What was your real drug of choice? Like, was it, and it can be a few things, of course, and some were just addictive people, but
Right.
What was the thing that kind of brought you to your knees?
Definitely heroin was what brought me down. So I felt like the alcohol and the cocaine, like I had a good balance going,
Only we would say something like that. I know.
But then as soon as it took that next step, my life was completely, it was unmanageable before, but it really went off the rails at that point.
Okay.
And I was going to be someone that was a homeless prostitute on the street if my life had kept going in that direction.
Absolutely. Well, hats off to you. There's not a lot of people that can fight through an addiction to heroin, and all addiction is serious and it takes its toll on us, but I really applaud you for fighting through that. So talk to me a little bit about, you said you first went into recovery at 23. What did that look like? So one day, your final use, like, were you homeless at that point? Did a parent get intervening? Like, what happened that sent you to recovery, and how was that recovery experience for you?
So I was right on the verge of homelessness, not able to pay for my apartment. And I was living in Seattle at this time. And I kind of acted like I was homeless because I wasn't able to make it home very often. So like I would sleep on the streets because I was, either so drunk or so high that I didn't know how to get home. So I was already kind of comfortable in that lifestyle. And I stopped talking to people that were close to me and people that actually cared about me, and had kind of traded in those family relationships for people that I would use with. And the last time my mom came to surprise visit me, and it was just like the worst situation that I'm sure she had ever seen. And so we left my apartment. I was in the car, and I woke up in Arizona, no longer in Seattle.
Yeah.
So and then she decided that I needed to go to rehab at that time. And if you had talked to me back then, I probably would have still told you that I was fine. I still had my job. It's okay that I slept in the park sometimes.
Yeah.
That was my mentality.
Yeah.
And really, like, that sounds so absurd to me to tell you today, because it's a completely different outlook, because nothing about my life was okay, but I had become so sick that that's what I accepted for myself.
Wow. So she transports you to Arizona. What recovery center did you go to? How was that stay? Do you feel that was the catalyst you needed?
It was for a little bit. So I went to the Meadows up in Wickenburg.
Okay.
And that was really safe for me because I couldn't run away.
Yeah.
So I'm a runner. If something gets uncomfortable, I don't want to talk about it. I want to put a Band-Aid on it and then move on. And so, I don't know Arizona. I'm in this middle of nowhere kind of hellhole, Wickenburg.
Yeah.
And that's what I needed.
Yeah.
And I met so many people that were just so influential on me. And I met other women that had the same stories that I did. And they told me that it was okay to kind of look at your story and accept it and move on from it. And so I think that's what I had never done, was anything that hurt, I never looked at again.
Yeah.
And so I was living with all of that pain, and I just never talked about it.
So you went there, and now you stayed sober since then, that experience. You haven't had a relapse?
I did,
okay.
yeah.
You stayed sober. Okay. So
no, I did have a relapse.
You did have a relapse.
Yeah.
Okay. So tell us about that, because relapse, real quick before you tell us about that, relapse is a part of a lot of people's story.
Absolutely.
And I have to say that for me, when I first went to rehab, I thought, no, I'm not going to have a relapse. And I was so enraged every time they had a relapse prevention class, or they were just always, it's okay if relapse is a part of your story. And I thought, this is stupid, not having a relapse, And, I got out of rehab and I was sober for about 6 months, and then I had a relapse, a very long relapse. So I think what I try to do in this podcast is say, yes, there's a lot of people that get it right the first time, but there's also a lot of us that don't. And I think it helps to actually talk about relapse and what that looks like. So you don't have to feel hopeless. If you're listening to this podcast right now and you're in the middle of a relapse, that's okay. There's a way out of it. And, you have that strength within you. So in saying that, Brittany, tell us about your relapse and what that looked like for you. And did you kind of see it coming? Were there things you think you could have changed or avoided? I mean, obviously you lived through it. Tell us about it.
Yeah. So even before I go into that, my view on relapse prevention when they would talk about it was that I'm better than that.
Yeah.
So that was my first problem was I couldn't relate to what you were saying about like, oh, I'm not going to do that. I was like, well, I don't even need to make this plan because, I'm not going to call anyone. I can do it by myself. And so that was a lot of where my troubles with relapse came in because I wanted to do everything by myself. And so I had been seeing someone in Seattle. A lot of my relapse, I think, was triggered by a bad relationship.
Sure.
And so that same person from when I was 19 came back into my life really this last year. And I let him come back, and I stayed sober for about another 6 months while he was using and drinking kind of in my space, in my safe space. And I let that happen right up until I just couldn't anymore.
Yeah. And then you used. And then how did you kind of catch yourself and come out of that?
Well, a lot of it, so I stayed in touch with my sponsor, and her philosophy on how she described it to me was that I needed to separate the truth from the false and my reality from the delusion. And so the relationship that I thought I was in, the relationship that I, last year I would have told you that, I was going to get married, that, I was so happy that this was going to be the best man for me, really was abusive, and it was something that I had no business being part of.
Yeah.
And so I just had to take a hard look at my life and realize that if I stayed in it, I relapsed only on alcohol, so I'm grateful for that.
Yeah.
But, if I had stayed there, then I would have had a needle in my arm again.
Yeah. Well, I'm proud of you. I'm glad you got out of it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, I guess, for us, the listeners, what would you say to someone that's currently trapped in shame? Maybe it's over their addiction. Maybe it's over an abusive relationship, because you've experienced both. What would be some advice you'd give to someone in that?
So a lot of how I think about it is how I would talk to my best friend. So I have a hard time standing up for myself and making the right choices for myself. But, I would think about it as how I would tell you. Like if you came to me with something that you were struggling with, I'm not going to tell you to suck it up.
Yeah.
But I would tell myself that. And so I think that it helps me frame it as how I would talk to my best friend or my sister. And that really puts it in perspective to, you wouldn't tell this person that they need to be stronger and that they're weak.
Yeah.
You would tell them that they deserve love and that it's okay that they fell down, because it's what matters is getting up.
Oh my God, I love that. That is so true. And then what would you say are some stigmas around trauma and addiction and all of that? Because for me, I feel like even in trauma and abusive relationships, we find stigmas and people can have cast judgment. And what are some things that you identify with or have experienced in your journey?
I think a lot of stigma is that you don't recover. Or what I hear a lot is people that say oh, based on your history as a child, you have daddy issues and you're never going to have a healthy relationship with a man. And so I think a lot of that comes into play, and a lot of women will tell themselves those lies. But that's not true, because you may have that past, but that doesn't mean that you can't move forward from it.
Absolutely. And, we are all lovable. We are all valuable. We all came here, I think, for more than to suffer a life of addiction. So, speaking of that, you're doing a lot right now. I've been kind of like just trying to keep it zipped, but I want to know more and have you tell the listeners about all the ways that you're turning your life around right now. You've got some news for us, I think, and tell them about your school. Tell them who you are today.
Yeah, so today I'm about to graduate law school. I'm pregnant, so I'm going to start a little family, and like really everything is different. And if you looked at my life right now, like I'm happy, and that's a miracle in and of itself that I'm able to look you in the eyes and tell you that.
I love it. And, when you came in the other day to the beauty lounge and, you were a beautiful model for us then, I could feel that from you. And that was really the first thing I was like, I got to get her on this podcast because I could feel that joy. And I'm getting goosebumps right now. But like, the fact that you're doing all this with your life and you're a strong, empowered woman, like you're going after life, grabbing it, taking it, and you're bringing a beautiful life into this world. And I want to remind you that you get to teach and show this child all that I'm gonna get emotional, all that unconditional love that you deserved when you were a baby, and you're gonna give it to someone else now and be that guide and light for them. And I know that AA has done a lot of things for me, but some of the relationships that have come from that have really been paramount in my life. And so one thing I tell to the listeners is AA may not be for you, but at the end of the day, try things out. Don't make judgments on things. And for each of us, we have our own way of getting sober. I don't try to preach on this podcast. I think before I have you, leave us today, I'd like you to maybe kind of summarize a little bit of how either AA or some other tools have helped you, because you've made this pivotal change in life that I think a lot of people listening right now, gosh, this girl had such a rough childhood. She was on heroin. Like now she's about to become an attorney. Tell us about all that for you, how AA played a part or what you use now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I definitely attribute a lot of my success to AA because that was something that I needed as a catalyst for change. So I couldn't have done it by myself, and I don't believe that. I think people can do it by themselves, but I think it's a lot harder.
Yeah.
And so that was something that I needed that group of people to kind of take me in and become my family. And that was something that I didn't have. So I really vibed with having someone treat me like family. And so I used that to kind of propel myself, and but it wasn't enough for it was enough to make the initial change, but it didn't keep me sober. Like I told you, I did relapse because I didn't do a lot of the changes that I needed for myself. And so for me, it didn't go deep enough because I needed different trauma therapy. And really, like, AA didn't make me love myself. It helped me stop drinking, but I didn't make that change that I needed to make in the end.
Yeah. And I think, like, for me, the self-hate when you're first trying to get sober and you're trying to climb out of that hole, there's so much there that community for me of AA was like a way to relate. All human beings want to relate and feel that they have something in common with someone, and to not feel like this piece of shit, for a lack of better words, and to have that community was really helpful. But I agree. It's funny you mentioned therapy because in one of our future episodes, we'll be having my therapist on as a guest.
Oh, awesome.
And I think, I always tell the listeners, therapy can help. There's all the things that we should do. It's always a full puzzle and there's all the pieces. So before we part, tell us a little bit about maybe 3 daily habits that you use to stay centered and grounded as you kind of go through this process of recovery. And then, maybe how you help others and if that kind of comes into play.
So really important for me is when I wake up, I do a gratitude list. Because in addiction, I was someone that, I would be so angry that I woke up. And so when I wake up today, I like to set the tone for what my day is going to look like. And that makes a big difference for my perspective on the day. And so I'll think of 3 things that I'm grateful for. And then I try to run. I try to do something every day. It's becoming a little harder as I'm getting bigger.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm doing now. And And let's see. And then I do gratitude lists at night as well. And I try to check in with at least another person during the day because isolation is a problem for me. Mm-hmm. And so I make sure that I'm not only focused on myself, that I'll give someone a call and make sure that they're good too.
I love that. I love that, especially in these times where the world is just hopefully starting to get back to normal. Isolation is not the right way to go about things. We need others. We're social creatures, and having that help and that stability and, again, that community. Okay, my dear. Well, thank you, Brittany, for joining us on the podcast today. Before we part, ways that you can find and stay in touch and catch up with us at abuserecoverysuccess.com. Also, April_the_hills at Instagram and TikTok, and April Hill YouTube. Tune in to season 1 and 2 if you want to catch up and really see how this whole thing got started. Thanks, guys. There's no hill